Welcome back to another episode of the Mailbox, wherein I respond to questions. In this case, I'm responding to real questions from real students from a college biology class. These are mostly juniors and seniors who wish to go to medical school, and they have asked a number of questions in a discussion forum, and I am responding to those. So as you listen to my answers, please keep that in context, that I'm responding to a group of students, and I'm trying to provide them feedback on, I'm trying to answer their particular question, but I'm also trying to address like what their fundamental question is, right? Get down to the root of the assumptions of their question, and then try to use that question as sort of a teaching moment as I respond to it. So with those caveats in place, let's take a look at today's question. Whew, okay, we come to this question that goes far beyond science. So I'll take a bit of a stab at it. Why does life continue? Through our readings, we're being taught information regarding life as a whole, how the process of natural selection continues, and so forth. During these readings, I began to wonder about certain aspects of these processes and just how exactly they continue to happen. Why does genetic drift continue to occur? Why do mutations continue to happen? Could they stop? I'm putting words in this person's mouth, but we've seen other questions from other classmates that are kind of similar. Like the question about what if there were no mutations, or what would happen if all mutations stopped? That suggests that somebody thinks that there could be a situation where there are no mutations. So here we're seeing, what if certain aspects, I've been thinking about certain aspects and just exactly why do they continue to happen? Could they change? Could these rules for how organisms adapt and change over time change themselves? I'll stop here and I'll just say that genetic drift, natural selection, mutations, they're almost like, we don't have laws in biology, but they're almost like truisms that must be true because of just the way that the world works. All right. I was saying at another time that mutations are just the byproduct of sloppy chemistry. Anytime you mix chemicals together and you have chemical reactions, not every single reaction is going to be exactly the same. There's going to be misreactions, right? Two things are going to bump into each other in a slightly different way, and they're going to react in a little bit different way. So you can predict the overall reaction, the majority of the reactions, but you're always going to have alterations, right? Chemistry is never perfect that way. And since DNA is a chemical, when it copies itself, there's a mechanism that's very efficient at putting in the right base and putting in the right pieces and building this thing and making an exact copy. But because it's chemistry, it's based on statistics of like there's so much stuff available and you have so much time to grab this particular molecule. And in a rush, you're going to grab the wrong thing once in a while because it just happens to be closer to the active site and it fits well enough that it kind of fits in there instead of the right thing. And so you plop the wrong thing in the wrong spot. It's mutation. Mutations happen. Okay. And that's just a byproduct of the way the world works. Like everything we know about chemistry says that mutations are going to happen. You cannot have 100% fidelity. You just can't in these processes. Following the processes, it's fairly simple to see how they come about. Like, it's kind of natural selection is simple once you really get a hang of it. And genetic drift, that's a more seemingly complicated process, but it follows mathematical statistical rules, right? And it's very predictable in the sense of what are the probabilities of things happening. With an example being how whales of modern day differed from their land-dwelling ancestors. In other words, this person can see that there's gradual adaptations of things that already were there, just modifying them slightly in order to gradually shapeshift one thing into another. One thing has stayed on my mind, though, throughout all these readings. Why exactly does all this happen? Why does it all happen? Why life? Why are we here? Why do we have these genes that continue to create life? that continue to adapt life to exist. What keeps these genes going? Why does this whole system just decay? We have this idea of entropy, right, in the world, which most people think of entropy as disorder or things running down. I've done a bunch of reading on entropy, and I recognize that that's an overly simplistic way of thinking about it now. But nonetheless, it's still a useful thing, especially when I think that's what people have in mind. They're thinking about the fact that the complex chemicals, the general tendency for them is to fall apart eventually, right? So you have these really complex organized systems, and especially systems for like replicating molecules. The replication of DNA is a really highly organized, complex structure. So this student has probably taken genetics before this particular class, probably took genetics from me, in which case we went over this incredible, right, DNA replication process, right, and all the proteins that are involved in that. And so why don't they have mistakes in them such that maybe they break down, and then that breaks down the process of faithfully reproducing and making it even less faithful, which makes more mutations, which then just makes the process even worse. And like, why doesn't it just all spiral down? It's like, why doesn't everything just decay? Why do we have these genes that continue to create life and that continue to adapt life to exist? Why do we continue to adapt? Why not just make the same thing? We've kind of addressed that many times. And part of it is just, it's inevitable. Since you can't make something exactly the same, you can't clone yourself, you're going to make changes. In which case you're going to modify whatever was past is going to be modified into what's in the present. So change is inevitable. Change can't seem to not take place. And then you have the added effect of, we've also discussed this as well, that if you didn't change, right, I've done a whole video on this, like the thing about life, and I think I started this class. Yeah, actually I did. I started this class with this observation. The life is the result of enormous efforts being made to not change, and yet life is also the result of the necessity of organisms to change. Right? That's not the exact wording I used. Life tries not to change, but if it were successful in not changing, it would kill itself. That's really the answer to this question. If you didn't change, if you didn't have mutations, if you didn't have natural selection, if you didn't have genetic drift, if you didn't have any of those things, then you wouldn't have evolution, right? Right? That was the null hypothesis, Hardy-Weinberg. None of these things occur, well, then you don't have evolution, you don't have change. What you'd have is you'd have cloning. You'd have one organism making an exact copy of the next, an exact copy, an exact copy. It doesn't change, right? It makes the same thing over and over and over again. But then we said, but what if the environment changes? That organism is adapted to that environment, and then it makes a copy of itself. But in the new environment, it's not so good for that environment. How would it adapt to that new environment? It can't, because it doesn't make any mutation, doesn't have natural selection, doesn't have genetic drift. There's no mechanisms for it to change, right? Unless you have supernatural intervention, there's no way for that organism to adapt and change to that new environment. And so cloning is the inevitable route to destruction, right? It may not happen in 1 generation or 5 generations or 100 generations or even 1,000 generations, but ultimately cloning, exact duplications, will result in an organism being completely unfit for any future environment. All right, so life tries to stay the same, because if it makes too many mistakes, it'll also mistake itself out of existence, right? Because a lot of mutations are very negative. So you can't make too many mutations. So you can't make no mutations, or you're in serious trouble in the long run. You can't make too many changes, or you'll kill yourself and your offspring, because you'll create cancer and create all kinds of other problems with essential genes. There's the Goldilocks Zone. You try to stay as much as you can the same, but because of the laws of chemistry, you know you can't do it, so therefore you're making mistakes. You try to limit the mistakes by creating ornate mechanisms for fixing errors, but even those aren't perfect, so you eventually mistakes leak through. But fortunately, that's a good thing, because you have to accumulate some change and create genetic diversity, because genetic diversity is the cure for changing environments. And there is no environment that stays the same forever, at least on this physical earth. Let's go back to the question. Why do we have these genes that continue to create life? What keeps these genes going? Why does life continue to exist? I do not ask this from a nihilistic standpoint, or that we should rebuke faith, but out of genuine curiosity. I believe my question may coincide with the age-old, what is the meaning of life? Yes, I think there's a little aspect of that to this. But in of itself, it's far more vague than what I ask. The meaning of life is fruitless to me. The meaning of life is fruitless to me. I wish to know why life continues, or keeps continuing. Okay, I'll give a scientific answer to this. I've already given a lot of the scientific answer to this, but let me stick to sciencey type answer first before I make any attempt to go beyond that. Natural selection, which is a process that it's going to happen because there's variation, and because variation makes different characteristics. Different characteristics enable organisms to live differently in the environment. So the environment is so some organisms are going to live better in that environment than others. And therefore, they're going to have a better chance to have offspring, in which case they are passing their information to the next generation, right? So I just described the basics of natural selection. That's happening. And it's hard to not have that happen, all right? And so why does life persist? Because if life didn't try to make more offspring, it wouldn't persist, right? I know that sounds like a really obvious statement, but that's what would happen. Look, if an organism was really happy and content with its life, and it said, I don't want to reproduce, all right? That's like, I have no desire to reproduce. Then what would happen to it? Well, it wouldn't reproduce. And which means it wouldn't pass any information to the next generation. Which means it wouldn't pass any information to the next generation saying, make an organism that doesn't have any desire to reproduce. Right? Because the lack of desire to reproduce probably has some biological, probably has some scientific reason for it. Right? I'm not talking about humans right now, and like I'm conscious and I'm like, I just don't think I should reproduce because there's too many humans on the earth, or whatever your reason is, right? I'm talking about a rabbit, and the rabbit's just like, something's happened to it such that it just looks around and goes like, I'm not interested in mating. All right, so I'm not going to mate. But then it doesn't pass its genes down. Well, whatever it is that gave them that sort of like, I'm not interested in mating, whatever the genetic component of that is that constitutes that behavior. Sorry, my dog's over here scratching around, getting ready to lie down. Whatever that genetic stuff was doesn't get passed to any offspring. What does get passed to offspring? The neighbor, that rabbit's friend, who does look around and goes like, yeah, I want to reproduce. I'm doing everything I can to reproduce. I'm looking for a mate. I'm propositioning every single female around here, every other female around here to find out who's going to mate with me. They're going to have offspring. And then their offspring are going to do what? They're going to have that particular attribute as well, since there's a genetic component to that. And they're going to reproduce. So what happens? It's as simple as natural selection selects for organisms that want to reproduce. It's just like, it selects against organisms that don't reproduce. Therefore, natural selection creates the persistence of life. Right? It's selecting for the persistence of life. It's hard to select against the persistence of life, because that in itself will create its own, it'll kill itself. It'll kill how should I put this? That type of natural selection would not continue as a process for very long, because there would be nothing to select at some point, right? So natural selection is consistently looking for organisms that reproduce the most efficiently, because that's the way to get the most genes into the next generation that have that particular profile. So you're constantly augmenting, you're constantly reinforcing that particular behavior. Now, human beings, being conscious, whatever consciousness is, being able to reflect upon our past, present, and be able to look into our future, can say to ourselves, I understand these processes. I understand how this works. I understand that that I could choose not to reproduce. Now, some would say, look at that and say, well, even that is got a genetic component to it. Like there's something about your genes that shape the way that your brain thinks. And maybe you're thinking very altruistically. You know, and that is a particular type of brain interaction, right? You got certain kinds of chemicals in your brain that are produced by the combination of genetics you have that gives you more altruistic behavior than maybe somebody else. And you're thinking of it as, I think it's best if I don't reproduce. Like maybe I know I have certain characteristics or traits that I don't want to continue to persist in the population. I understand how natural selection works, and I am going to be the thing that stops that I'm going to stop this particular trait from increasing in the future population. Or there's just too many people. I don't want there to be more people because that's not going to be good for future generations. And I want to protect the kids of other people and have them have a better life, right? Altruistically thinking. But even that behavior might actually be a form of something that is the result of different genetic combinations. Now, by you not passing that down, you're not creating more individuals that feel that way. You're going to allow others to reproduce that obviously have more of a desire to reproduce, in which case their kids probably, if there's a heritable component to that, those kids are likely to reproduce. So it's like, it's very difficult. It's really, really difficult to inherit characteristics that intentionally try not to to promote more reproduction. Because that particular behavior is always being selected against. And so that behavior might crop up once in a while through different combinations of genetics, but it always is being suppressed, right? It's never the most fit genotype in the population. And so all populations of all species, I mean, can you think of any species that is going like, you know what, we're just going to reproduce less. And we're just going to have fewer and fewer individuals over time. And you can actually measure and see that they're resisting reproducing on purpose, right? That doesn't happen. Like there are many populations that are decreasing in population size, right? But it's not because they're like going like, you know what? I think we're not going to reproduce, and we're just holding off. No, they're trying as hard as they can to reproduce. It just happened to be they're being unsuccessful, right? There's competition. There's new predators in the area, and even though they're reproducing a lot, they're being taken out at a faster rate than they're reproducing, so the population is shrinking. In other words, they're not competitive in that environment. But it's not that they're not trying to reproduce. Every species is putting all of its effort and all of its thought into reproduction. And that is a product of natural selection. It's a reinforcing thing. It just constantly reinforces that behavior. And so going back to why do these things persist? Why do these genes persist in populations? Because they're kind of selfish elements that will continue to promote themselves, over time. It is, when we boil down how the world operates, this is just a basic operating principle. It's a natural thing that falls out of how everything else works. I kind of go back to chemistry again. Like chemistry works this way. And as a result, these things have to happen to organisms. They're going to have mutations. And the fallout of having mutations is you have variation. The fallout of variation is you have differential reproduction. If you have differential reproduction, then you have some genes becoming overabundant in future generations compared to others. And that's a train that you just can't stop. And that's why we would say that all organisms are always evolving, right? And they're not necessarily like becoming completely different types of organisms, but they're always changing in some way. They're always changing their alleles as they go. All right, I don't think I can really take a real big swing at the whole meaning of life thing here. So I'm just gonna leave it there. And I hope that helps. I hope that gives you something to think about. All right. I'm too tempted because I'm looking at this last statement. The meaning of life is fruitless to me. I wish to know why life keeps continuing. Now, I gave a scientific answer to just like, here's a physical reason why life continues. And then you can ask, so that's why, but that's not the real why of that. Right? So is it just, well, that's just a natural constant. So I'm just the result of I'm just the result of the physical processes of this world. Right? That's where one has to ask, is there more than just the physical processes of this world? Right? In different religions, and I think myself being a Christian, I would say that, God has established these rules and this is his mechanism of maintaining life, right? So God has created the rules by which the world works. And these rules naturally result in organisms being able to adapt and change to the changing environment, right? So there is a world created which has energy involved. As long as there's any energy anywhere in the universe, there's going to be changes that occur to the natural conditions of the world, right? Because energy changes forms. As it changes forms, sunlight being converted into various forms of heat and other things into sugar by plants on Earth and so on, right? There's all kinds of, then the Earth traveling around the sun moves at slightly different distances, so we get different amounts of heat. That creates weather patterns and, right? There's always change. And because there's always change, organisms have to have a way to adapt to that change, right? Lest they not be able to survive, under different conditions. And so what better way to do that than to have these really flexible systems, right? We have genomes that have variation in them, and we have different forms of reproduction, and it's not really possible for an organism to survive forever in the world, the way the world's chemistry works, because there is degradation of things over time. And so the best way to persist as life is to make more copies, right? One organism makes another copy of itself. And there's a form of sort of rejuvenation in that copying mechanism in order to start a new organism afresh. And so that's one way we also persist as well. And so you notice that all organisms on Earth, there aren't ones that just they live forever and they don't have to reproduce. Like reproduction is a necessary product of how the functions of the world work, such that this is the way to escape ultimate death, right? And decay is to constantly reproduce. And so again, put in the larger context, I would say, like, if you want to believe that a higher being has set those rules in place in order to allow for this dynamic world to persist and continue, then that gives you some sense of like why things are the way that they are, right? Maybe you could dream of other rules for how worlds should work. But if these are the sets of natural laws of how matter and energy interact with each other, in a lot of ways, I see the way biology works as being the inevitable outcome of those particular laws. This is just the way it has to be. This is the way organisms have to interact with each other. And this is the only way they can persist, is through these things. And these mechanisms have made these things possible. All right, so that's not getting you that much closer to the meaning of life. But I'd say if there's intent behind the structure of the universe and the world, then you could see that maybe there's purpose in different organisms. And then you can ask about the question of what's the purpose of human beings. Then you get to interesting questions about, like, why are we more aware than other organisms are of these things, and why can I, well, what's, I think, therefore I am, right? Then you get into all this other philosophy and other religions, the religious thoughts about why is it that I can think about, why can I even ask this question? Why can you ask this question? How can you, if you're just genes, right, and all you are is just running out a program, what is it in that program that allows you to even ask this question about whether you are just a program or not? Right? Why does life persist? Why do I persist? Why does anything persist? The very fact you can ask that question is an interesting question in itself. Right? That's a very interesting question to ask yourself. Like, how is it that natural processes could result in me thinking that question and asking what the origin of those natural processes are? All right. So what I'm doing right now is I am definitely, I'm expressing my own thoughts about this and just giving you some things to think about, right? This is my own, just personal meanderings at this point. I stopped talking about science a little while ago. But I take these questions to be somewhat personal too, right? I mean, these are real personal questions. I'm giving you a personal answer to that. And I could go a whole lot further with that, but I don't want to strain that relationship we have, in which we're sort of conversing about the science of these mechanisms, but we're sort of allowing ourselves to branch out and dabble into other areas, because the topic of this class inevitably leads to these types of questions. And I think that everybody needs to think about something more than just strictly, like, what do I know about the science of this? What does this mean to me in my interactions with other people and other human beings in this world? All right. And so it does lead you back to the question of, like, what is the meaning of life, right? That's my long-winded, rambling, and hopefully semi-entertaining answer to why does life continue. Thanks for hanging out with me this entire time. Yeah, we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.